Hey there, true crime fans. Welcome back to For Criming Out Loud and our bedtime series called Crime Me to Sleep. We have been reading While Idaho Slept, and this is the 8th episode. So if you're new here, make sure you subscribe, and that way you can go into the playlist and start any, really, of the true crime books that we've covered from the very beginning. Let's get into episode 8 of While Idaho Slept. Part 7, Chapter 33. It didn't take long for the trickle of media the first few days after the murders to become a roaring flash flood. It was no longer 20 or 30 reporters seen walking around campus or traipsing over the downtown Moscow sidewalks or camped in front of the police station in their puffy jackets. It was 100 or more vying for access at any given time. Access to cops, or to King Road neighbors, or to students who had returned to campus after Thanksgiving break. Especially coveted was access to the victims' family members, who by now were turning off their phones and pulling their drapes closed against the cameras that had found their homes. Media representatives held notepads and long lenses and audio recorders and searched for headlines, mostly in rugged North Idaho, sometimes downstate in Boise, tracking survivor Dylan Mortensen, but also in Washington, where Ethan's family lived, or in Arizona, chasing after Jeff Kernodle, Xana's father. Access was gold. Reporters couldn't write the King Road story without it, and the process of obtaining that access was simply a numbers game to those covering the Moscow case. The aim was to tactfully bother everybody and hope that a few would talk. Those who had flown to Moscow on their network's corporate dime had the most time to spend looking for leads. They'd stayed in hotel rooms for weeks on end, ate the same continental breakfast each day, and soon drove the same slippery slope roads each morning in the dark once the weather had changed, and it changed quickly on them. By early December, 15 inches of snow covered the ground outside the murder house, and the streets in the neighborhood were a sheet of ice. News Nation's senior national correspondent, Brian Enton, was often seen in the King Road parking lot, sometimes standing atop a lighting case to add height for better framing in the camera lens when the ground was made uneven by snowfall, his crew's equipment shielded by an industrial-sized black umbrella. The temperature dipped to 1 degree, and the LED lights aimed at Enton provided the only exterior heat in the neighborhood. Between shots, Enton loitered with his hands in his pockets for warmth, his face expressionless under a base layer of makeup as he waited to go live. Sometimes he texted with Kaylee Gonzalez's family, who believed in the value of keeping Kaylee's story in the press, at least until her killer was caught. With Enton's insider access to the Gonzalez family as a good starting point, he began to report on the homicides daily, and News Nation saw a tsunami-like surge in viewership. Moscow was also overrun with less pedigreed YouTubers trying to make their names in the true crime reporting genre. The monetization of their channels paid for their travel, and in that sense, they operated their businesses no differently than the big networks. Clicks on their videos meant cash for their coffers, and cash allowed their operation to be run and the story to be told. But while a major network usually covered the case with agreed-upon decorum, freelancers profited more from showing personality. Bullhorn Betty, an unaffiliated citizen reporting on the homicides, opened each of her YouTube segments as if they were splashy TV commercials for used cars. Betty's color palette for the case was hot pink, icy blue, and cupcake frosting white. Her Venmo, Cash App, and PayPal identifiers scrolled beneath the screen, soliciting donations, and a pop-punk soundtrack screamed as loudly as her tag, instructing followers to hit the like button. There was a contrast between design and content in Bullhorn Betty's channel. Though the subject was as grim as they come, Betty's presentation was 1980s glam, and her audience ate it up. On the day that Chief Fry had ordered the victims' vehicles towed from the murder house, Betty walked gingerly across the iced-over street out front. She wore a pink winter coat, gold hoop earrings the size of mason jar lids, bejeweled sunglasses, and a knitted pink cap pulled down tightly. She had a cell phone, filming a scene. A late-model tow truck had begun to hitch and remove Ethan and his brother Hunter's shared four-door cherry red Jeep Wrangler. It looked newish and expensive. Betty's grainy footage showed her primary camera woman holding a DSLR camera with an oversized lens and a microphone attachment. The young woman filmed the tow truck as it veered out of the driveway. Off camera, Betty shouted excitedly, "Oh, hey!" She ran after somebody, then came back to explain to her viewers that she had just been talking with News Nation's Enton. "We met Brian Enton when he wasn't a whole lot of anything," she told her fans, breath puffing from her mouth in the bitter cold. "He only had about 20,000 followers when we first met him, and we've ran into him throughout the country following these cases." By these cases, Betty meant the trail of murder across America, the bread and butter of her channel, and the hundreds of other YouTubers doing the same thing as she was. When a big homicide case hit the news or social media, they jumped into their cars or booked airline tickets and chased down the story. Kaylee Gonzalez's Range Rover was sheeted with ice in the driveway. Police officers monitored the tow truck activity, and the traditional press corps had lined up directly across from the driveway, their lenses all pointing in the same direction. "Emotions," Betty started to say, describing to her followers how it felt to be at the scene. "It gets to you, being here, feeling the vibe, the terror." She seemed genuinely overwhelmed. She was breathing heavily. The tow truck driver appeared to be wrestling with his chains. Something wasn't working right, and another man had walked across the snow to help. But then Betty added, "Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Please consider making a donation to PayPal, Cash App, or Venmo." The cloud-covered sky cast tones of muted gray across everything in sight. The press corps kept snapping their photos. Later in the day, they'd hurry to the impound yard for more. "I can't express how painful this cold is on my hands," Betty said. Her exposed fingers had gone pink in the frigid air. By the end of her 2-hour video, only police cars remained in the parking lot, and a few of the press corps vehicles idled in a row along the street, burning fuel, while their gear was packed into rear hatches. Over the next few months, Bullhorn Betty continued to cover the case, quote, "printing money," unquote, as she said about her channel. But Betty also spoke on camera to her viewers about the psychological cost of pursuing the grisly real-life crimes. Pain and darkness, she said, accompanied her continued exposure to the case, like the opposite of rose-colored glasses. Hers made everything in the world look bleak. When they weren't on camera, the traditional press corps in Moscow often looked blank-faced and beleaguered too. Access wasn't free, perhaps. It was just a way in. Chapter 34. Across social media, dozens of other unaffiliated citizens were reporting on the case as well. The fastest, most compulsive coverage began on Reddit and 4chan, then trickled across Facebook, where one dedicated group, the University of Idaho Murders Case Discussion, had grown to 250,000 users posting daily. More often than not, the Facebook posts played off mainstream media's reporting. Whatever had made it to network news was disseminated online by group members eager to discuss what they had learned from nationally respected anchors. Sometimes it was the other way around. National news anchors played off what they had learned from social media. Reddit user posts eerily accurate Idaho crime details was the headline on a leading national network in the early days after the murders. The segment included 3 law enforcement experts weighing in. For months afterward, that Reddit user's comments about the murder weapon and positioning of the bodies was discussed by multiple anchors and their law enforcement consultants. News Nation's Ashley Banfield reminded viewers that there had been a serial killer in Canada that the online community found before the police found him, and the police ignored them. So there are some lessons to be learned from that, and there are some things the community can actually help with in terms of investigation, Ashley said. The investigative work of citizen sleuths, in other words, could be compelling. They scanned the victim's old social media for clues, but also did more traditional research, like private investigators. They made phone or in-person inquiries of associates of the victims, mined public databases for documents, and created false social media accounts to conduct social surveillance on people they suspected of involvement in the murders. Some citizen sleuths went so far as to perform in-person surveillance of associates' residences, then doxed their addresses, posting them online for those who wanted to look even further into someone they'd concluded might be a potential suspect. It was risky business. For every helpful tip armchair investigators uncovered, there were multiple instances of misplaced suspicions and harm to innocent citizens. 4chan users theorized that the murders were revenge for a fraternity squabble, with Ethan as the killer's initial target. This led to dozens of posts on Reddit and finally on Facebook, where the theory was discussed 1,000 times. It seemed plausible. Fraternity infighting, crossed lovers at the center of the chaos, dark secrets. It seems almost impossible to think that the perpetrator was focused on one of the girls and was willing or able to take on Ethan, said a Redditor. The perpetrator was actually focused on Ethan, and killing the girls may have been to throw off LE, law enforcement. This theory didn't stop at idle speculation. Citizen sleuths named the parties involved and drew links between them in the animosity they imagined went all the way back to high school. In short order, the students and fraternity members allegedly associated with the squabble began to receive death threats from strangers. Several of them reportedly went into hiding. One of Ethan's fraternity brothers spoke out about the wild conjectures on Twitter. It is one thing to be wrong, but it is an entirely different thing to be peddling a false narrative with poorly vetted sources to generate engagement for your profile. Leave us alone, please, he pleaded. Jack DeCour received death threats too, simply because he'd been Kaylee's lover. He'd been scorned by her and vengeful, the sleuths decided. And a U of I professor started getting death threats after a TikToker claimed she had put a hit on the residents of 1122 King Road. A neighbor on King Road also began getting threats after a social media mob deemed him quote-unquote creepy in interviews he gave to the media about living so close to such a horrible tragedy. Most of the rumor and speculation occurred during lulls in investigative updates from the Moscow Police Department. Lies and conjecture spun wildly inside the information vacuum, even though it had only been days since Chief Fry's last press conference. Even the mainstream media wasn't above winging it when the facts weren't available. Between official updates, they interviewed ex-law enforcement agents with expertise in homicide investigations, but these experts sometimes set aside critical analysis in favor of their own titillating speculation. One ex-agent regurgitated the rumors that Kaylee had had a stalker, even though the Moscow PD had already debunked the theory. The former agent had gotten his information from days-old news. Sometimes more insightful was the commentary on Facebook by those would-be agents too young or uncredentialed to participate in official law enforcement circles. In a forum dedicated to the case, somebody posted a blown-up photo of Kaylee's wrist, isolating her smartwatch. Within hours, hundreds of commenters discussed whether the watch, perhaps synced to an Alexa or other digital concierge, might have recorded the sounds of Kaylee's murder, screams in the dark, or a tussle that caused the watch's recorder to activate. The line of inquiry was unique to our time, but not to be discarded simply because it originated on non-traditional investigative platforms. In fact, while retired agents tended to focus their commentary on headlines fed to them by corporate anchors, social media sleuths acted independently, which could be more conducive to investigative creativity. In the Facebook photo, Kaylee's watch brought to mind the information-rich black boxes aviation investigators dig from the rubble after airplane crashes. Was she wearing her watch at the time of her death? If so, what did it try to tell her? Did it vibrate, for instance, when Kaylee's heart rate exceeded its optimum beats per minute? What did her heartbeat sound like after 4 a.m. in that loneliest of hours? When John Gillum, a formidable-looking former Navy SEAL and FBI agent, appeared on Fox News, the anchor began the interview by stating, "The headline today really is that there isn't one. There is no information on who committed this crime." She was referring to the Moscow PD's recent policy of withholding case details and progress reports from the media, as well as from the family members of the victims, essentially shutting them out of the investigation and shutting the viewing public out, too. Gillum interjected, "I don't blame them at all. The family members have been on podcasts, they've been on newscasts, and law enforcement is going to automatically pull back on the information they provide if that occurs." What he was most interested in talking about was the killer. The perp would be a young male, Gillum speculated, and somebody who was probably odd to be around, who made people feel uncomfortable. Chapter 35. Steve Gonzalez understood the need for more eyeballs on his daughter's case, and he did the news circuit more frequently now, appearing sometimes twice daily, usually by split screen, but sometimes in person, with national news correspondents braving the snow to meet him. On air, Gonzalez frequently accused the Moscow PD of moving too slowly to find a suspect, and he praised social media sleuths for their diligence. On camera, he looked agitated, anxious, or on the verge of tears, and sometimes all three. Gonzalez said he was praying that the extra attention, the millions chattering, would lead to finding Kaylee's killer, because it looked to him as if the Moscow PD's relatively inexperienced homicide team might let the case go cold. Chief Fry went on the local Fox station to address the fears. "This case is not getting cold," he smirked. "We have tips coming in. We have investigators out every day interviewing people. We're still reviewing evidence. We're still looking at all aspects. No stone will go unturned." He'd been working around the clock, and he cared about the families. "I'm a dad," he said. His eyes filled with tears. "With daughters," he added, "and that's tough." His small-town police department had been raked across the coals by mainstream media that week. He talked about visiting crime scenes like the one at 1122 King Road. "We're human," Fry said. "We don't go to these and just turn it off. It affects us. But we have a job to do, and we're going to continue to do that job. We're going to continue to push forward." He wanted his community and, most important, the families of the victims to know that the police department was doing everything it could. Chief Fry would find whoever was responsible for the murders. That was the promise he had made. Kaylee's family couldn't take it on faith. They continued making appearances, and Christy, Steve, and their eldest daughter, Olivia, sat with Brian Enton at the Gonzalez home in North Idaho on December 3rd, 2022. The furniture in their living room was country clean, with a throw designed like an American flag draped over a bench. They sat on a leather couch, a large poster board mounted photographs of Kaylee behind them. Kaylee and Maddie's ashes were in containers next to each other on a shelf. Maddie's family had wanted it that way for now. The Gonzalez had been growing impatient with the police department's lack of transparency about their progress and about their suspect list. "Is there anyone that you have a weird feeling about, that the girls knew or that comes to mind?" Enton asked. "Not in the immediate circle," Olivia stated, "but a few of the names that have been circulating around, I think it's hard not to dig into. I don't know how much of that is because we have so little information from law enforcement, and how much of it is a sister or father's intuition." Christy Gonzalez said she felt as if the police had been too quick to clear a number of acquaintances of the victims. Kaylee's sister agreed, but carefully added that Jack Decore, Kaylee's on-again, off-again, had the full support of their family, despite online rumors. Other acquaintances had provided alibis that cleared them, but the police had not shared those alibis with the Gonzalez family. If they had, Steve said, the family might have felt more comfortable with the rigor of their process. "I don't know what would prevent you from sharing someone's alibi," Kaylee's father said. "I think that's what we're struggling with," Olivia agreed. Kaylee's mother began to cry during the interview, the stirrings of her turquoise-hued hoodie tied in a bow, her auburn hair in a ponytail. "It's terrible," she said. "I cannot fathom in my head what kind of person did this and why." Her daughter rubbed her arm periodically. Enton noted that the Gonzalezes were postponing Kaylee's funeral until a killer was caught. They couldn't move forward, they had said, with the thought of somebody still out there in the shadows. "Are you nervous at all?" Enton asked. "Because in Moscow, we talk to students. People are really nervous there." "They should be," Steve interrupted. He went on to talk about the Moscow PD's use of the word targeted to describe the killings. He didn't like that. He felt that the terminology pitted the parents of each victim against one another. If Kaylee had been the target, for instance, did the other parents harbor resentment against the Gonzalez family? Worse, against Kaylee? It was a tough question to wrestle with while mourning their daughter. Of all of the things for the Moscow PD to go public with, this one stung. Enton suggested, maybe that was just a way to calm people down. "I felt like it was strategic," Gonzalez agreed. "If the killings hadn't been random, that would reassure students that they had nothing to fear. Nobody was coming for them next. It was a strategic way to keep people from hitting the door, transferring out, and turning that place into a ghost town." Even with Fry's statements, many students had returned to campus with trepidation. They walked in groups now. They carried weapons in their backpacks. They looked over their shoulders when they walked home at night. Snow had recently covered the impromptu flower memorials that had been placed around the U of I campus. "You never think you're going to lose your little sister. Never," Olivia said. "You never think you're going to have to bury your daughter." "Absolutely unbelievable," Christy said. She wiped the hair from her face, her wedding ring sparkling. She closed her eyes, breaking into tears. Chapter 36. Fry hadn't revealed much about his investigation, but by the end of November, the Moscow PD already had a suspect on their radar. It would take another month before anybody outside of law enforcement would know, and that was intentional. On November 25th, 12 days after the murders, the Moscow PD asked area law enforcement agencies to be on the lookout for the white sedan that forensics examiners now believed to be a Hyundai Elantra. Only 4 days later, on November 29th, Washington State University police officer Daniel Tiengo looked into white Elantras registered at WSU. He found one registered to a PhD candidate, Brian Koberger, who lived in a student apartment complex. Another WSU officer, Curtis Whitman, was also looking for Elantras on that date and found the same vehicle while patrolling. It was parked at the Steptoe Village Apartments. The Hyundai both officers had identified had Washington State license plates on front and back, but records showed that on the date of the murders, the vehicle had been registered in Pennsylvania, where no front plate was required. The out-of-state student had changed his vehicle registration to Washington just over a week ago. Koberger's Washington State driver's license information was reviewed by police. He was a white male, 6 feet tall, and 185 pounds. He fit the general description provided to investigators by Dylan Mortensen. Evidence of driving a white Hyundai Elantra and having the approximate stature and look of the suspected killer wouldn't make a case, but Fry's task force started running Koberger down. His studies in criminology were notable to the cops. They already had Koberger's cell phone number. He had been stopped by police for a minor driving violation in Moscow on August 21st. They ran his cell through their databases and found that it had been issued by AT&T, which they served with a narrow warrant to identify any of the company's numbers that had pinged, or utilized in this instance, the towers servicing King Road at the approximate time of the murders. Fry's team was hoping that Kohberger's cell would place him at the location of the 4 students' deaths. What they found was the opposite, that between 3 a.m. and nearly 5 a.m. on November 13th, Kohberger's cell used no towers at all, meaning it had likely been turned off, but only for that period. He might have turned it off before sleep, like many people at that hour, or he might have turned his phone off intentionally before committing his crimes to prevent law enforcement from tracking it. The initial AT&T subpoena had covered only the towers near the murder house. The absence of information on Kohberger during those hours justified the filing of a broader warrant to obtain Kohberger's full cell records between November 12th and November 14th, the day before and after the murders. This took time to get. Days had already passed with Fry biting his tongue, not able to talk publicly about this promising lead that pointed to a criminology student. Court records later suggested that the task force had put Kohberger under surveillance, although their methods were kept secret. When they finally became available, the AT&T records confirmed that those approximately 2 early morning hours were the only time Kohberger's phone had been turned off. It was a good piece of circumstantial evidence. He seemed to have intentionally been evading cell towers. The AT&T records also showed that the user of Kohberger's phone, presumably Kohberger, was traveling away from Kohberger's apartment at approximately 2:47 a.m. on November 13th, and then south through Pullman when the phone stopped reporting to the network, either switched into airplane mode or turned off. It began reporting to the network again at 4:48 a.m., less than 30 minutes after the murders, when it pinged on US 95 south of Moscow. The phone pinged towers in a circuitous route through the countryside before returning to Kohberger's residence in Pullman, where the phone pinged again at approximately 5:30 a.m. and stayed there for several hours. Then, cell tower activity at approximately 9 a.m. showed Kohberger's phone traveling away from his residence again and returning to Moscow. It pinged a tower servicing the King Road residence at 9:12 a.m. Astoundingly, the records suggested that Kohberger may have been to the murder scene that morning, hours after the crimes had been committed, or at least his phone had. It continued to ping the King Road Tower until 9:21 a.m. when he departed again. While it appeared that Kohberger had visited the area around 1122 King Road for 9 minutes that Sunday morning, what he was doing there only he knew. The police had not yet been called to the crime scene, and the house would have looked almost exactly as it had the night before, only now he would be viewing it in daylight. The police department now tracked his cell tower pings even further back and discovered he had made a dozen visits to the home in the months leading up to the murders, primarily under the cover of darkness. One visit occurred in the late night hours prior to his August 21st traffic stop. His phone had pinged at the King Road cell tower for over an hour. It appeared that he'd been pulled over on his way home. Not surprisingly, time codes of video surveillance of the Elantra appeared to sync tidily with the cell tower data collected by investigators. Where the phone went, so had the white Hyundai Elantra. It traveled away from Kohberger's residence at 2:44 a.m. as observed on WSU campus security cameras. The phone had pinged that same area at 2:47, indicative of the phone and the car traveling together. While the phone was turned off, the vehicle continued to trigger footage as it moved toward the King Road residence. The Hyundai had made its speedy departure from the scene at 4:20 a.m. Approximately 28 minutes after the murders, when the phone was turned back on, the white Hyundai Elantra and the phone were synced by cell towers and video surveillance. They were taking the same route. The conclusion seemed obvious. Brian Kohberger had left his apartment, turned off his phone, then driven to the murder house, where he had likely killed Kaylee Gonzalez, Madison Mogan, Xana Carnodal, and Ethan Chapin. After the murders, he had sped away. He had traveled deep into the countryside for approximately an hour before returning home. And in full daylight later that morning, he had briefly returned to the crime scene. Fry's team had a lot of questions they still couldn't answer. What had Kohberger been doing in the hour immediately after the crimes, driving through the countryside, so dark that if he had pulled aside to the side of the road and cut his headlights, his eyes would have struggled to focus? Had he pitched the murder weapon, his clothes? They would have to wait for those answers, and they would need more evidence before they could initiate an arrest. But that evidence was accumulating by the day, almost more important than the rest of what they'd been tracking. Kohberger's name had appeared in the recently obtained genetic genealogy results Fry's team had been awaiting. The DNA left behind on the knife sheath was a match to Kohberger's family line. There was one small problem. Kohberger had left the area weeks ago. Chapter 37. Classes at WSU had ended for Christmas break in early December. Kohberger, a PhD candidate with a teaching assistantship, had finished grading his students' papers. He had packed his white Hyundai Elantra with his belongings on December 12th, then departed campus for a 2,500-mile drive across the United States back to his hometown of Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, in the Pocono Mountains. Riding shotgun with Kohberger was his 67-year-old father, Michael, a tall, heavy-set man with the physique of an aging football player. Michael had flown west from Pennsylvania to accompany his son on the long drive back home, squeezing his large body into the passenger seat of the sedan as they set out. Instead of driving directly across the northern United States, Kohberger took a longer southern route through the mountainous west, reportedly to avoid a whiteout snowstorm in parts of Idaho and Montana. On December 13th, his white Elantra was seen by an automated license plate reader in Loma, Colorado, where the car had cut east on I-70. On December 15th, a Hancock County, Indiana sheriff's deputy flagged down Kohberger and his father on the interstate just past Indianapolis. Kohberger pulled his Elantra to the far right shoulder, where a small hillside of grass had gone muddy with melting snow. The FBI was reportedly tailing Kohberger as he traveled. The methods they used remain undisclosed, but traditionally, the process involved unmarked vehicles or small, low-flying surveillance planes, even high-tech drones, all coupled with a robust system of license plate readers dotting the map. The feds were reportedly monitoring from afar as the sheriff's deputy got out of his vehicle and approached the passenger side window of the Hyundai. The ensuing interaction recorded by his body cam. Michael Koberger rolled down the passenger side window. He had had 2 bankruptcies over the years and a lot of sad trouble with his son, drug abuse, and an interaction with the law when, at 19, he had allegedly stole one of his sister's phones and sold it, according to subsequent news reports. And the boy had always had a difficult time making friends. He looked at the deputy approaching. "How are y'all doing today?" the deputy asked, boldly leaning his forearm across the interior of the door. Michael Koberger nodded, leaning backward slightly. He squinted upward through his glasses, waiting for more information about why they had been stopped. The deputy then requested Brian Koberger's driver's license. Other vehicles roared by. As Brian searched for his license, the deputy told him, "You was right up on that van, man. I pulled you over for tailgating." Koberger nodded, looking calm. He handed his driver's license across his father's torso. "Where are you headed?" the deputy asked. "We're going to get some Thai food," Brian told him. We coming from WSU, his father corrected. "What's WSU?" Apparently, trying to be agreeable, Michael added more information than necessary. He explained that his son was a student at Washington State University, and that in fact Brian had received a text alert about a SWAT standoff near campus that very day. The small talk only made things confusing for the deputy. "So you're coming from Washington State University, and you're going where?" Eventually, they described their circumstances with more clarity. "We're slightly punchy because we've been driving for hours," Michael explained. "Do me a favor," the deputy eventually said to Brian. "Don't follow too close, okay?" He let them go with a warning. The feds reportedly monitored Koberger's Elantra pulling back out onto the interstate. Less than 10 minutes later, Brian Koberger was once again stopped by the police, again pulling his vehicle to the far right shoulder. The traffic was heavy, with big 18-wheelers roaring by. This time, it was an Indiana State Trooper who approached the passenger side of Koberger's Elantra. Michael again squinted up through his lenses. The trooper spoke across him, just like the last cop, explaining to Brian that he had been driving too close behind a semi-trailer. "You had only one car length," the trooper said. Brian admitted they had just been stopped a few miles back for the same reason. "You got stopped by a trooper?" Michael again over-explained. No, it had been a sheriff's deputy, and he told the story of the SWAT standoff that day at WSU. The story didn't seem to track with the trooper. "Well, I'm not going to give you guys another ticket or warning," he interjected. He leaned his forearms on the open window ledge and peered into the car. Eventually, he added, "Where are y'all heading to?" They told him Pennsylvania. "Pennsylvania? That's a long haul. You guys scared of airplanes?" In the blue sky above, thick cumulus clouds were moving closer. Koberger pulled his Elantra, filthy from travel, back onto the interstate. The entire trip, there had been a police bolo be on the lookout for a white Hyundai Elantra possibly associated with the murders in Moscow, and additional public requests for information about the car. It is not publicly known why that BOLO was issued when they had already had Kohberger as their primary suspect. A law enforcement officer who did not wish to be named suggested the BOLO may have been for appearances only, so that Kohberger would falsely believe the police were still lost in the weeds of their investigation. Luckily, neither the Hancock County Sheriff's deputy nor the Indiana State Trooper had known about the BOLO, or they might have prematurely begun to question Kohberger about his vehicle. If he had gotten edgy, what then? The feds had reportedly been tracking Kohberger from a distance on purpose, allowing the task force time to build a proper case. But any skittishness by their suspect could have been catastrophic. There might have been violence on the road, and Kohberger could have absconded. Until now, he seemed to have no idea that he was being watched, and Chief Fry wanted to keep it that way. Kohberger and his father arrived at the family home in Albrightsville on December 16th, and the FBI contacted the Pennsylvania State Police to assist with surveillance of the Kohberger residence. It was a modest home in a wooded, gated community, and like each of the homes in the neighborhood, it sat on a relatively large parcel. The Kohberger house had 3 bedrooms on an acre of land. Kohberger's behavior during his initial days in Pennsylvania was monitored closely. He was observed taking his vehicle to a local mechanic for servicing, and he was spotted in his driveway wearing surgical-style gloves while meticulously suctioning the Hyundai's upholstery and trunk with a shop vacuum. Oddly, and quite suspiciously in the eyes of the surveillance team, Kohberger was also observed at 4 a.m., taking trash bags from his family residence and walking them down the long driveway to deposit them in his next-door neighbor's trash bins, not in the bins belonging to his own family. Later, under the cover of darkness, their surveillance team grabbed the Kohberger family trash before any more of it could disappear and shipped it back to Idaho. Forensic experts at the state crime lab outside of Boise put on their own rubber gloves and went to work. Chapter 38. Chief Fry and his team had gotten their biggest break yet. The garbage bags snatched from the Kohberger family included a DNA sample from Michael Kohberger. According to the crime lab, this sample was a paternal match to the touch DNA found on the knife sheath that was left behind at the murder scene next to Maddie Mogan's body. Whoever had opened that snap on the sheath was the son of Michael Kohberger, and the man only had one son. Brian Kohberger, a student living just over 10 minutes from the victims, appeared to be the killer that the world had been looking for. They had not found an exact match to Brian Kohberger's DNA in the trash bins, and that was unusual but not prohibitive of a warrant. Kohberger's exact DNA profile was a bridge that investigators could cross later, and they would. For now, lead investigator Brett Payne submitted a probable cause affidavit for an arrest. Warrants were immediately approved for Brian Kohberger to be taken into police custody in Pennsylvania and for search and seizure of property at the modest family home in Albrightsville, including the white Hyundai Elantra sedan. What the police had hoped to find were blood or fiber samples on clothing, the murder weapon itself, incriminating documents, stored data on Kohberger's electronics, computer devices or cell phones, or any other evidence of the crimes, even property belonging to Maddie, Xana, Kaylee, or Ethan, such as their clothing or identification cards or other trophies Kohberger might have taken from the scene. Search and seizure warrants were also issued for Kohberger's apartment in Pullman, Washington, and for the office he occupied as a student teacher in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology on WSU's campus, but those would wait until after his arrest. Getting to Kohberger before he could flee was top priority. For now, the authorities in Pennsylvania devised a strategy for taking Kohberger into custody. They would have to approach late at night, that was certain. It would be safest for everybody, including Brian Kohberger's parents. And they would have to keep a tight lid on the pending arrest. With a large number of cops now working the case across multiple states, and with the intense media scrutiny and volume of reporters chasing down stories, it was always possible that a rogue associate of a law enforcement officer could accidentally or purposely leak information for personal gain, or simply be too chatty at the local watering hole. If Kohberger got tipped off before the police department's extraction operation, they could be looking at a bloodbath when they went to grab him. Long after midnight on December 30th, nearly 50 tactical assets from the Pennsylvania State Police crept through the Brian Kohberger family neighborhood under the cover of darkness. They were serving a high-risk warrant on an alleged quadruple homicide perpetrator, and they weren't taking any chances with the number of assets working his extraction. It was better to be overmanned than under. Then, beneath a three-quarter moon, the tactical team did what it does best. They cracked the hinges off of the Kohberger home door, broke out windows, and stormed the residence. According to reports, Brian Kohberger was found wide awake, standing in his parents' kitchen. He was wearing latex gloves, shorts, and a t-shirt, while stuffing his personal trash into Ziploc baggies for later disposal. That was odd, to say the least, but appeared to explain why the surveillance team hadn't found his exact DNA profile in the family bins. Kohberger had either been hiding his trash and consequently his DNA from the authorities, sensing they were gaining on him, or his peculiar behavior was related to a possible obsessive-compulsive disorder that would be later alluded to online. Kohberger's parents appeared shocked at his arrest and at the subsequent search of their household while they watched their boy being put into handcuffs and taken from the residence. Investigators confiscated, among other things, several handguns, knives, black clothing, black gloves, black face masks, size 13 athletic shoes, medical-style gloves, computer and cell equipment, and the family shop vacuum that Kohberger had used to clean his car. From the Hyundai, investigators seized a shovel, gloves, hiking boots, goggles, the seats and cushions of the vehicle, a door panel, the headrests, and the gas and brake assemblies. Brian Kohberger was shuttled to the Monroe County Correctional Facility, where he changed into a jail-issued jumpsuit and was discreetly booked. He was held without bond until he could be returned to Idaho. While the search while the search of his on-campus office later that afternoon reportedly turned up nothing substantive. Investigators raiding his apartment in Pullman found and confiscated a black examination-style glove designed to be resistant to chemicals and puncturing. Police also took the dust container from Koberger's vacuum cleaner, several hair strands, a possible animal hair strand, a computer tower, stained mattress covers, and cuttings from an uncased pillow that showed reddish-brown stains. That day, Chief Fry held an impromptu press conference from Idaho, addressing Koberger's capture. He stood beside an American flag in a wood-paneled room among members of his task force. The media was caught by surprise, and many filmed him with their cell phones. Last night, he started at the podium, in conjunction with the Pennsylvania State Police and Federal Bureau of Investigation, detectives arrested 28-year-old Brian Christopher Koberger in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. Fry choked up before continuing. On a warrant for the murders of Ethan, Xana, Madison, and Kaylee. He took another breath, steadying himself. Being in the limelight was still not his forte. These murders have shaken our community, Fry said solemnly, and no arrest will ever bring back these young students. Then, blinking back tears, he spoke more emotionally than most police chiefs. Over the past 6 weeks, I have been continually reminded of how much our community cares. Locally, public support has been exceptional, with kind words, food for investigators, and letters of support. You will never know how much your words of encouragement helped us through these trying times. I appreciate, he took another breath, appreciate each of you and each of you for your kindness. When it came time to answer questions, Fry took a couple dozen. One reporter asked, "Your department and other investigators on the case took a lot of flack for keeping information close to your chests. Are you glad that you did that?" Fry smiled knowingly. "I will 100% stand behind the way that we handled this investigation." But there were holes in the case that nobody, except perhaps Koberger's lawyers, had thought about. The PhD student in criminology was preparing to fight. Well, that wraps up our episode of for While Idaho Slept. If you're enjoying this new bedtime book series so far, please make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you don't miss the next episode. Also, if there is a true crime book that you'd like me to cover, please let me know in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for being here. I truly, truly appreciate all the support in this series, Crime Me to Sleep. Until next time, good night.